So I started and led a D&D group in order to teach some of my interested friends how to play. For this story, we'll be focusing on two: Warlock, aforementioned creepy destroyer of worlds and groups, extroverted but strangely had very few friends due to something being off about her. Every conversation involving her inevitably turned inappropriate, and she had a tendency to say things that made people uncomfortable. I put this down as her just being a little out there, and invited her to join, hoping a little escapism would help improve her social skills. Cleric is Warlock's best friend, and I mean best friend. I'm talking Han and Chewie best friend, Harry and Ron, Jake and Charles best friend from Brooklyn Nine-Nine. Although it was very obvious who was the Jake and who was the Charles in this partnership. Cleric was very quiet and shy, talked very little in public, and seemed the most uncomfortable whenever Warlock derailed the conversation into her crazy inappropriate tirades. I have no idea how they managed to stay best friends, but they did. Warlock asked if she could join as well, and I accepted because, hey, the more the merrier, right? So the first game begins, and immediately the first red flags in what would become a sea of red flags over a previously perfectly fine runway occur when Cleric, whom I'll remind you was extremely quiet and introverted, showed up to the first session with 2 solid pages of backstory for her half-elven cleric. I was impressed, and more than a little surprised, but became immediately suspicious. The way she interacted with her backstory and role-playing was more akin to cosplay than actual role-playing. It was like she wasn't totally invested in the character, and after some inquiries, I discovered my fears were confirmed. She hadn't actually written any of the backstory herself. Warlock had done it all for her, and basically handed her a backstory to use with little to no input from her. I also later found out that she'd heavily encouraged her to play cleric, even at one point using her religion, cleric was Christian, as a way to convince her. A quick note on another, much creepier red flag. Both backstories, for Warlock's own character and the one she wrote for cleric, contained a male love interest. And believe me when I say they were the same exact dude. A heroic, brave, pretty boy with a heart of gold who finds the heroine during dark times in her life and saves them with unconditional love and adoration. In itself, it's weird, but both backstories also included a horrible thing happening to the love interest. Dead in one due to the cleric failing to save him, and another saw Warlock do a bad thing and ran away horrified. And the heroine was out to find, or resurrect in Cleric's case, him, and prove that she still loves him. She also sent me fanfiction of her character's love interests and encouraged Cleric to write her own. There were pages upon pages of her describing, in very explicit detail, how good the love interest was at doing things, and how many times they gave each other one in various different scenarios. At one point, she started writing alternate universe fanfics for her own characters, and following that, I honestly lost count of how many times I saw her share one with the title involving the words "first time." Luckily, Cleric did not give in to the pressure from Warlock, but unluckily, that meant Warlock decided to take over. Turns out, she snuck one major detail about the backstory past the Cleric. The night her love interest died was also the same night Cleric and him did it for the first time. And what followed was an 11-page account of their first night, with eye-watering levels of detail that would even make professionals in that genre ask her to tone it down. I deleted all of these without reading them, but couldn't bring myself to tell her to stop. It was just an awkward conversation to have at the best of times. But between this and her constantly making everything that crossed her path inappropriate, I was beginning to suspect that her weirdness might be stemming from her being more pent up than Stephanie Meyer after 3 months at an all-girls Catholic retreat. I decided to leave it and hoped that once she got it out of her system, she would be alright. On a less creepy but still weird note, both stories involved their characters being ostracized for their racial differences. Warlock herself asked me what race was the most discriminated against in my world, and picked a tiefling based on that exact premise. And she referenced in Cleric's backstory that her cleric was ostracized for being part elf in a human community, despite me saying on several occasions that elves and humans got along quite well in my world ever since they teamed up to stop Orcus from destroying the world at one point. Whenever I brought this up, she would nod like she understood, but then go right back to telling Cleric to play up the discrimination more in her role-playing, as if I hadn't even spoke. But that is how it went with the Warlock. If I ever told her something that contradicted how she thought it should go, she would basically pretend it didn't exist. That was just how it worked in her little world. So the game begins, and immediately more red flags. Warlock slept with literally everything. And I mean everything. If there was a thing between them and their goal, and that thing had a conscience, a body, and at least one working limb, she was rolling with it, and even tried convincing me that a 12 was enough for a literal bone devil. This was also when she would embark on one of her very frequent tangents about how appealing her character was. She made a tiefling warlock and decided that, with no input from me, a 16 in charisma basically meant she was the hottest thing alive. So, not an action passed without her mentioning a random specific detail, even when she was even casting something like a spell. These tangents creeped everyone at the table out, especially me, since she would insist on role-playing every flirtation, and it would go on for 10 times longer than they needed to be. One of the other players did their best to salvage the situation by role-playing his paladin as growing up in such a strict household that he didn't even know what reproduction was, but it was clear he was struggling. All of his desperate inputs in the hope she would realize the effect she was having on the rest of us felt like a dying man reaching for a life raft. A life raft she swiftly popped with a dart gun, inappropriately shaped of course, and left him gasping for air. She seemed to think she was the life of the party, and that her inappropriateness was somehow appealing to us. Every single time she did something inappropriate, she would none so subtly turn to a male member of the table and do this really weird wink that looks like a bad sitcom actor having a stroke halfway through a major punchline. It created this bizarre situation wherein whenever she opened her mouth, half the table would suddenly desperately need to run to the loo, or see something really interesting in the ceiling, or make a breakthrough regarding the dice tower building that they must be intently squinting at for the next 10 minutes to persevere. This wasn't even mentioning her in-game behavior. Her character, whose backstory I later found was basically copy-pasted from some anime she watched, absolutely dominated the play session. She would insist on long, lengthy quests to achieve her goals, and would drag the party along by the nose while simultaneously telling them all about her backstory. Yes, she was an edgelord of the worst kind, who imagined the rest of the players as endlessly curious as to what her mysterious past was, when really they couldn't care less, and just wanted to get on with the main quest. I played along for a while, but even when I tried to move the spotlight to someone else, she would find a way to steal it back. At one point, the paladin character was given a quest to rescue some prisoners of war from a hobgoblin fortress. She literally waved him aside during his own mission briefing to negotiate with his direct superior on behalf of the rest of the party. She then had the nerve to ask him why she herself should care about doing it. The irony sailing merely over her head, just like the last semblance of team spirit and cooperation in our group did as it hurled itself out the window to its death. But all of this pales in comparison to her biggest flaw. The thing I will never forgive her for, because it is the worst bad player sin imaginable. It killed a new player's interest in D&D. See, whenever we got together, it didn't take long for an unofficial seating arrangement to crop up around the table, but nobody enforced this harder than Warlock. At every session, she had to be sitting next to the cleric. This was so that throughout the whole session, she could continually instruct her on what to do, what to say, how to play her character, what her character would do, say, / think at the time, etc. I learned to just speak over the continual whispering sounds coming from my left, since at the time I didn't really grasp what was happening. Warlock picked up the rules faster than Cleric, and I just assumed she was trying to help her. It wasn't until too late that I realized what was really going on. At one point, after a long quest, they saved the god of time from his stasis that he placed on himself in mistakenly thinking the world was about to end. After freeing him, a lengthy process involving a rather original and well done, if I do say so myself, boss fight against an old man with only a dagger and 5 hit points, but who would be endlessly resurrected once killed until all the clocks in the room were smashed. The god turned back time to the moment Cleric failed to save her love interest to give her another shot. She redid the moment, this time preventing his death, thanks to hindsight, and woke up in the present day to find them now happily married and having left the other adventurers behind years ago. This led to some really nice role-playing involving her character, and for the briefest of moments, I saw a glimmer of potential in the way she expertly roleplayed the clash of emotions, and the breakdown her character went through as a result. The happiness of saving her love interest clashing with the sadness of leaving her friends behind without a goodbye was actually quite touching and well played out. Until it was ruined immediately when Warlock, who had been silent for the last 5 minutes, dropped a new backstory in front of her mid-role-playing, saying, "Here's your new character." And just like that, the glass window shattered. Cleric retreated back into herself, quietly picking up a new backstory and rolling her stats. Stay tuned for the second part where I detail what happens when she took up the position of DM. Things like this really stink, especially for new players when you have that kind of dynamic. I don't think I could handle a minute of that type of behavior, let alone a full session. Always have a session 0 to set up expectations and understand how players act. I would even suggest running one shot first that can be expanded upon so that way you don't feel locked in for the entire story when playing with new players. What do you all think about this situation?